Alright, so these are some notes about the CIA and Imperial history by Hugh Wilford. And I'm not going to go over everything. I really say read the book if you sound interested in this. I'm not going to give everything away. That would be basically plagiarism at that point on some level. So Alan Dulles was one of the formative members of the CIA, I guess I'll just say, and he had a copy of Kim's Kipling under his deathbed. Kim's Kipling is a piece of colonialism, colonial literature, I guess, if you want to call it that. And so this represented Dulles' imperialistic infatuations, I would say. Operation Sunset. Nazi General Wolf and his men were given full exoneration by Dulles, and Dulles also greedily obtained Nazi gold in this exchange. So it gives you a sense of Alan Dulles as a person, and he would not follow orders, and he would lie on purpose to what he had done or try to cover up what he had done and do willy-nilly on the drop of a dime what he felt was necessary for the country. Even before the war, World War II ended, Dulles had many Third Reich business contracts. It was primarily in this way that the CIA filled its fiscal coffers at the end of World War II. And he doesn't really go over this in the book, but he talks about Alan Dulles in more detail in other ways, so I just thought I would put that out there. Hubert Gonzalve Liotti. He was born to an aristocratic family, a military family, that is. He was French. He had a Kipling-esque fascination with Arab Northwest Africa, or Maghreb. Many scholars speculate that he was gay. He found the colonial lifestyle more hospitable to his notion, I'm sure, of sexuality, but also the notion of domestic life just didn't appeal to him beyond that, because France had lost recently in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, as well as the Paris Commune of 1871. In French Indochina, under influence of his commander Joseph Gallieni, he helped develop the strategy of quote-unquote progressive occupation. The occupying imperial force built roads, telegraph lines, medical clinics. Liotti reckoned this to a spreading oil drop. I'm going to butcher some French here for you. L'une tâche de houle. I'm sure it's butchered on some level. So another way that he put this is it was peaceful conquest, or this was a population-centric way of doing things instead of being nasty and doing reprehensible methods. So this doctrine supposedly, and I'll get more to that later, supported the French mentality, mission civilstris. These methods, were used later on by the USA government during the Cold War. La méthode Liotti wasn't actually always peaceful. Many of France's colonies resisted, as had those in Britain's India colonial bid. At the next posting of Madagascar, Gallieni and Liotti responded to this resistance with, quote, brisk action, quote, a bloody campaign, quote, complete with the assassination and exile of indigenous rulers, is how one historian put this. They also implemented French surveillance of Malagasy, that is Madagascarians, I guess, if you want to put it stupidly, of Malagasy social society. They used the latest scientific and policing breakthroughs, such as the Bertillon method, fingerprints. France's African and Indo-Chinese colonies began to compare their lives with those of inmates in a giant prison. And I want to stop there and just add kind of my own commentary beyond the notes and say that during the Afghani conflict, the United States of America, in the early 2000s, we gathered biometric data of Afghanis live on the battlefield. And we would protect the members of the team that were specialists in gathering these biometric markers, including fingerprints. So you pretty much could boil it down and say this is just an advancement of imperialism and colonialism that began in a big way with Liadi and now has more biometric markers, because we could then grab scans of eyes, iris scans for biometric data markers. If they died and it had been about 30 minutes, the life would go out of their eyes and you could no longer get the biometric eye scan data. So we would try to prioritize that. We would grab DNA if we could. And I believe the word is panopticon. This was a prison in the medieval era where there would be a tower up above and it would be a circular kind of prison, oblong, I'm guessing, so that you could easily see every side of it. And there may not even be someone in that tower, but the psychological effect is that there is someone watching me, every single thing that I do. And so we went from that to now feeling like that in this colonial context in a different way as it advanced. To the point we're at now. So one of the main kind of theses of many, the main one is, the thesis is this: the CIA is really, despite whatever it tried to do or whatever the better members of the CIA really did do or felt about it, the CIA has an imperial legacy. France's African and Indo-Chinese colonies began to compare their lives with those in a prison, like I said. So 1912, France declares first Algeria, then Morocco as a protectorate. And, there are a lot of Maghrebs in this area, and then Liadi is the main one in charge as Resident General. Publicly, Liadi defers to the authority of the Sultan. Rule with the Mandarin and not against him, declared Liadi. Once the Mandarins are our friends, the country will be pacified. After 1921, Liadi was promoted and he was now Marshal Liadi. The French public were absolutely delighted with him, and they felt he was, quote, a great imperial proconsul. One historian calls the French at this time as having Moroccan mania. Many Moroccans saw the Sultan as a French puppet and rebelled against the colonizers' rule. The RIF, R-I-F, were especially difficult to subdue, compelling Liadi to starve them out. So he starved the Berber tribes there in Morocco. So I want to stop for 1 second again, and you'll notice I'm going to be looking in a mirror, basically. So what does that look like with what America did later? And have we done something similar? or let's look at Israel in particular in this case. They have been on some level inarguably starving Gazaans, and that literally has a colonial history. And you can go all the way back to Layadi, and he's starving the Moroccans so he can get what he wants out of them. And now you have I'm going to say Yehu over here doing a similar bid. Anyway, 1925, Paris places the protectorate under direct administration, and this forces, in effect, Marshal Layadi to resign. Layadi spends the rest of his life in his birthplace of Lorraine. As with Kipling's end of his life, I guess I should phrase it better, he was sad about the decline of the French Empire he'd served his entire life. Oh, poor baby. 1928, he is called to Paris and helps organize a great, I'm quoting here, exhibition celebrating France's colonial empire. It opened 1931 in the outskirts of the city. It was called the Exposition Coloniale Internationale, complete with Malagasy village replicas, as well as those of Maghreb, of course. Layadi had to have it. Even a vast plaster reproduction of the great Cambodian temple Angkor Wat. Anti-imperialists denounced this event, and French citizens, surrealists, artists staged a rival exhibit entitled Ne visitez pas l'exposition coloniale. Again, butchering French, it's good. Despite that, French citizens attended, Layadi's festivities, I guess let's say, in the millions, often coming back multiple times. They just couldn't get enough of it. Layadi died in 1934. He thought his end-of-life project a wonderful success, and it made French citizens proud to be part of La Plus Grande France. A few decades later, U.S. government launches similar efforts to grow American citizens' support for post-colonial interventions in Africa and Indochina. So again, looking at the mirror, what did we do? Oh, we're not an empire. Oh, we're not imperial. I'm going to jump ahead because I am not going to go over everything. If you want to know more, read the book. Okay, so let's talk about how imperial really were we around the time that we made the Philippines a part of the U.S. on some level. So let's just jump into this part. America features little in the beginning history of new imperialism. That's the phrase, I couldn't remember. A few island colonies were annexed to the USA in the 1890s. Comparatively, America owned 1% of the world's total land surface, whereas the British Empire controlled 23%. So that's almost a fourth of the entire world that the British Empire has at this time, compared to our 1%. A few years after annexation of the Philippines, the U.S. prepared Filipinos for self-rule. William Howard Taft, as president, created a public school system there, inculcated by the Thomasites, so named after the Army transport ship they came on. 1935, USA grants Commonwealth status to the Philippines. 1945, U.S. liberates the Filipinos from Japanese rule on Independence Day. And their Independence Day is July 4th, 1946. So it's not just the USA that celebrates its independence on July 4th. And we're going to stop there for a second because I want to talk about a little side aspect to this. So I just recently studied Unit 731, and this was the Japanese bioweapon program at the end of World War II. So the Japanese controlled the Philippines during World War II. So they also did biotech death camp experiments. Sorry, this is not fun to say. In the Philippines. So when we took it over as America, they had just gotten done with being treated like garbage, worse than garbage, by the Japanese. And so then we started doing, for some of the Filipinos, Operation Bluebird and Artichoke. And so these operations were not just relegated to Germany, as some may be misled to believe. It was a pretty widespread project, including the Philippines. So imagine you're the Filipinos in this time of their history. You just got done with Japanese rule, and they committed you to death camps. And now the Americans are committing you to guinea pig experimentation as well. And you have to come out of the other end of that as the Filipinos, and you get a sense of the struggle that they must have endured on a greater level than I feel many Americans seem to recognize. So at this time, the Europeans, July 4th, 1946, I'll remind you, were fighting contestingly to cling to their ailing empires. Quoting directly from the author here, America became the first great power to divest itself willingly of a colony. So that's probably the best thing I can say that is one of the most anti-imperial things perhaps I could say, but it's a little more complicated than that. But at the very least, that is a wonderful thing, isn't it? And I would commend it on some level. However, there were several underlying similarities, and that's the author's verbiage here. The reason for the Europeans and Americans' expansionism was the same. New markets, resources, strategic considerations, and a, quote, radicalized sense of national identity. Like Rudyard Kipling, quoting the author once again, Americans sometimes believed the Anglo-Saxons were to rule the world. There were various trans-imperial overlaps and entanglements, quoting the author there. The U.S. authorities of the Philippines built their administration on directly inherited Spanish institutions, census, police, and prisons. Other models were imported from the British Empire. And I would like to know what the forefathers would think of this. So yeah, we imported some tactics and strategies from the British Empire, and we did empire stuff after we left the Brits. And we're just sitting here being like, okay, so how do you be an empire? And what's the best thing to do here? I want to be an empire now. Quote, colonial architects in the Philippines, for example, imitated European hill stations, such as Shimle. I might have misread, it's pretty hard to read. Shimle, I'm pretty sure. The summer capital of the Raj, quoting the author there. While Americans were not Orientalists in the 19th century, meaning of the word, and that means they were not experts on the colonial cultures and societies they were ruling, they did exhibit Oriental discrimination, quoting the author again, accusing Filipinos of indolence and trickiness. Most of all, Americans resembled the Europeans in that they fought a counterinsurgency campaign against the Huks, Huks, later on. But even in 1899, there was a Filipino colonial rebellion. They were dismayed to have traded one imperial power for another. They launched a bloody guerrilla war. The Americans' response in some ways replicated the Indian Wars, which had just wrapped up. U.S. troops in the incursion, quote, indiscriminately killed some civilians, handed others into relocation camps, and practiced a torturous form of interrogation, the water cure. End of the quote. Americans' public acceptance of the counterinsurgency waned, so the U.S. resorted to even more extreme imperial methods, which were very similar to those used by the British in India and the French against the Malagasy. The hiring of local elites to crush the remaining pockets of rebellion. The U.S. also imported modern policing methods and surveillance technologies a la Layati. So it wasn't just the Afghani conflict. Here we are in the Philippines, and we did it way back then. We began to live Kipling for ourselves, stated an officer of this new Philippines constabulary. I think I have to talk about this guy. It's pretty important. I'm probably going to skip some of it, and you need to read the book. Ralph H. von Damon embodied this Filipino colonial regime in an individual sense. He was, quote, gawkishly tall with a, quote, lugubrious face and shunned the limelight. He was born in Ohio, 1865, the same year as Rudyard Kipling. He studied at Harvard, graduating before studying law. He then switched to medicine and became an army surgeon. The 1890s in America were a decade of civil industrial unrest. Von Damon participated in a military quelling for a violent miners' strike. This was likely, it wasn't just likely, this was a very formative experience for Damon. It left him with a feeling of, quote, enduring suspicion of labor protests and radicalism, quoting the author. And I'll give you a few examples of what he did when he was in the Philippines. So it looks like a wonderful, great thing that he improved their telegraph system. But the reality is the reason he sped it up is so he could have better information dissemination in his central intelligence gathering operation he was doing in the Philippines. So sure, he did a wonderful thing that was such a great benefit of the Filipinos. But in all reality, it had a really disgusting ulterior motive. So, basically one of the other examples I will give is he collected fingerprints and other data points of information, put them in an index file system, and this was fastidiously arranged to great detail and great organization from what I'm understanding. So he then leaves the Philippines, returns to the U.S. in 1902, and he left the foundation of a, quote, colonial surveillance state, quoting the author. And then he lobbied to create a centralized intelligence system within the U.S. itself that would do what was done in the Philippines to the U.S., to really just boil it down for you. The Army High Command at first resisted this. It was that usual Anglo-Saxon fear of secret state power. In 1917, against the ensuing entry of America into World War I, the new military intelligence section was put under the command of D-Man, and he got what he wanted. Now, Colonel DeMond borrowed heavily from the pretty new British intelligence services. The structure of MI, as it was called, had several different branches, and this is similar to M16, M15, even had British names. And so, again, what would the forefathers say about this nonsense? Just want people to consider for 5 seconds. So again, he was making a vast file card system of names, fingerprints if he could probably get them, I'm imagining. Whatever information, maybe they have a tattoo that's revealing, that can kind of strike with the contemporary nonsense. Well, then we're going to note that down. Maybe they have an oblong pinky finger, right? We're going to write that down on the index card, I'd imagine. Just hypothesizing here, but... So he was doing that to American citizens now, and he was utilizing a public-private network, is what it's called, as he had done in the Philippines. So this meant he was using a small army of patriotic citizens, vigilantes, or who he was going after by doing this. Okay, I'm just going to walk back and start over here. So it was a public-private network. This included a small army of patriotic citizens, vigilantes, and it was called the American Protective League. So for the American Protective League, instead of Filipino insurgents, they were now targeting anti-war dissenters. Does this sound familiar at all? By the way, this is why I think I have to mention DeMand. Other subversives, quote unquote, right from the author here, pacifists and anarchists. He went after German and Irish immigrants. So speaking of a contemporary where we're going after Mexican immigrants, well, he went after these immigrants, East Indian nationalists, and pugnaciously, again, I want to really emphasize that, pugnaciously, DeMond went after African Americans. Indeed, quoting the author here, it was as though the colonial intelligence expert was treating minority groups in America's society like colonies within the United States. End of the quote. I'm going to skim some of the stuff more here about DeMond. If you want to know more, read the book. I do want to talk about, at the time of his death in 1952, he had collected intelligence on some 250,000 American citizens. So about 250,000 on his list around the time he dies. And reputedly, this information was shared with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, as well as the young Californian Republican Richard Milhouse Nixon. So where did Nixon get the list to target people in the left? And where did he get the idea? And where did it all begin? This is why DeMond is very important to learn about. This is how we got to that point as America. We were doing colonialism and empiricism that was imperial to our colony there in the Philippines. Then we did it to ourselves. (1940), I think I have to mention this too. DeMand attends meeting with Hoover and the Chief of Army Intelligence. They agree the FBI would do the counterintelligence in the Americas, and the military would do so in the rest of the world. So, if you leave with one thing about DeMand, I'm not sure how you say his name, I don't give a damn how you say it, it's not worth it. Take this away from it. You can trace a direct correlation between U.S. colonization of the Philippines and the birth of the CIA. And DeMann is one of the most instrumental people in really making the CIA happen, even though it didn't really happen fully until World War II's end. This guy was the one who really laid the foundation, the groundwork for this apparatus. I'm going to jump quite a bit ahead here. I want to talk a little bit about the Groton School here, if I can find that part here. So yeah, I want to talk about the formation. We're going to jump ahead to World War II at the end of it, and the formation of the CIA. The whole agency had a patrician, and that's the author's word there, feel to it. Young WASP men of East origin and Ivy League educations. Quoting the author, males from other backgrounds, including even white ethnics, were comparatively scarce. End of the quote. Some white women officers, but only a handful had distinguished intelligence careers. Homosexual recruits were discluded for fear of blackmail. An environment of routine, aggressive, masculine heterosexuality. Women endured, quote, routine harassment ranging from innuendo to outright assault, quoting the author. Washington, D.C., with its large black population, only found themselves in roles as security guards and janitors on behalf of the CIA. Ivy League professors were tasked with recruiting the most promising students into the CIA. This was called, quote, the P source, the professor source. This is described as, quote, laying out of hands by historian Robin W. Winks. The practice was incredibly common at Kent's Yale. And I'm skipping talking about Sherman Kent, but I suggest read the book. Many of the Ivy Leaguers had attended one or another of a small group of East Coast prep schools. Foremost among them was the Groton School, Groton, Groton. It was founded in rural Massachusetts by the Reverend Endicott Peabody in 1884. He was the child of a prestigious New England family, having received his education in Britain. I wanted to say New English. So he was educated in Britain at the boarding school Cheltenham College, then at Cambridge. Due to this British education background, Groton had an imperial British sense of manhood and muscular Christianity and patriotic service. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith, calls it the Groton ethic. The Groton ethic resonated strongly with the East Coast WASP elites, most strongly with those who felt the U.S. should follow in Imperial Britain's footsteps. Theodore Roosevelt sent all 4 children to Groton. He attended Sunday chapel there to urge his kids to, quote, render service to the state. 3 of TR's grandsons, Kermit, better known as Kim, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Archie, and Cornelius joined the just forming CIA and also had gone to Groton